So over the weekend, we know that the identities of 2 federal agents who were involved in the shooting of Alex Pretti were made public through an investigation by ProPublica. Now, if you're not familiar, the ProPublica's website describes them as an independent nonprofit newsroom that digs deep into important issues, shining a light on abuses of power and betrayals of public trust, and holds powers accountable. So that's who ProPublica is in this story. Joining me now is investigative reporter behind that story that identified the agents. It's David McSwane. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So can we start with, David, the editorial process in doing this story? Can you take us kind of into any kind of a should we conversation when it comes to identifying these agents?
Sure. I mean, we have a story of national importance, some dramatic, gruesome video in which the citizen bystander was shot in the street, and there was a question about who are the officers involved. And in this country, we have a history, norm, and practice of law enforcement agents being identified through name tags and badges. And the first step in accountability when agents or police, exercise force, and there may be some question around that force, is to identify those officers, figure out who they are, and that allows people to investigate, families to figure out what recourse they may have.
And so Department of Homeland Security has not released the names, they haven't released much information. In your investigative reporting, is that typical? And is that part of the reason as well that you started digging? Where did you go to get the information?
Yeah, there's been an incredible amount of secrecy around ICE and immigration officials generally under this administration, and particularly in this instance because it was, these viral videos were very widely spread online. So the agency, the Homeland Security did say they're not releasing the names and has made it very difficult to identify those officers. And that is a departure from norms historically.
Also, we know that the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension was, they say they were shut out of the investigation into Renee Good's death as well. Did you look into that at all? Have you been able to sort of cover other aspects of this, of what's been happening here in Minnesota?
Yeah, I mean, that agency, as well as the governor and mayor of Minneapolis, have expressed concern that they weren't included in the investigation, and expressed concern to us about not being able to identify these officers. And in fact, in our reporting process, we went to those places and and asked them what they knew, and it sounds like there was just a deep level of frustration on the local level.
I'm curious what the reaction has been since the story's been published. What kind of feedback have you been getting from people?
Well, it sort of depends on which social media you want to use these days. I think a lot of folks are grateful now that there are these agents who are involved in a really high-profile, fatal incident have been identified, and those mechanisms of accountability can move forward. I do think that there are some people who agree with the administration that these agents who've been emboldened to use force in the streets, wear masks, and operate in complete anonymity should remain such. But as our editors described in the note that we published along with the story, it's in the public's interest to understand what law enforcement officers are doing and who they are when we see these sorts of incidents.
And I want to ask you a little bit about the agents themselves, because you talk a little bit about them in your piece. Before I do, though, of course, I imagine that you also have folks who, and I don't know if you've had any accusations of sort of doxing, and we know that Department of Homeland Security, we've heard from many agents across the country who say that they've been the target of death threats, their families, things like that. How was that a part of the conversation here for you guys?
Well, it's something we have to consider. I mean, we publish work that's in the overwhelming public interest, and Homeland Security and other agencies have used that line of accusing reporters who reveal information that they don't want out as doxing, and it does create safety concerns for reporters. But we have a job to do, and we're going to exercise it under this administration as we have in previous administrations.
So you identified the agents as a 43-year-old Border Patrol agent, Jesus Ochoa, and then 35-year-old Customs and Border Protection Officer, Raimundo Gutierrez. We have their names, we have their ages. What else did you find out?
Well, this is a developing story, and I'm certainly not the only reporter on this now. And there are internet sleuths who are doing, publishing things that may or may not be true. And of course, we have our process that really vets these sorts of things. I mean, what we do know is Ochoa joined in 2018. It was an aspiration of his for quite some time, according to his ex-wife, who I spoke with directly. And Gutierrez, I believe, joined in 2014. So these are not the new recruits under this latest push and funding to beef up ICE's ranks. They have had some training and have worked for the agency for some time.
Was there anything in either of their backgrounds or their work history that caught your attention or stood out to you?
No, I mean, these agents have been instructed by Homeland Security to really scrub themselves from the internet. So it's hard to find a lot of that stuff open source. I do know that Ochoa, according to his ex-wife, did attain a college degree from a Texas university in criminal justice. But we'll keep researching and get as much information as we can as it pertains to the public interest. Yeah.
Did your investigation take you down any other roads that you can talk about? I know you may not want to divulge what you're working on next, but I'm just curious if sometimes you start going down one road and it takes you other places.
Constantly going down roads and figuring out what is, deciphering fact from fiction and what can be supported and confirmed. And, that's the editorial process. And we have a rigorous process that involves multiple layers of editing and lawyers and these discussions that you referenced before we go to publication.
Yeah, and just really briefly, could you also, for those who aren't familiar with ProPublica, just describe a little bit about, kind of the who you are and what that process can look like?
Sure. We are an independent nonprofit organization, really a giant investigations team with a ton of experience and accolades behind that. And we've covered stories involving Border Patrol going back well over a decade.
Have you specifically covered, because I think a lot of us here in Minnesota aren't as familiar with Border Patrol, right? This is not something that we're used to. We don't know much about their training. We don't know. We're learning a lot here. As you and ProPublica have been covering this and covering the Border Patrol agents who are here, is there anything that you have found that you would want to share with us or give us insight into?
Well, it has been, I spent some time in Texas as a reporter, including, some of that, during some border surge operations. And, it did surprise some online that, a lot of Border Patrol agents have Hispanic and, Chicano heritage and surnames. That's not uncommon in the Rio Grande Valley. These are good jobs with good pay and great benefits. And, there are a lot of good agents who, take this work very seriously. So that's an interesting thing that I, had forgotten. If you hadn't spent any time on the board, that might seem a little bit of a surprise. As you know, a lot of law enforcement experts, including, some local law enforcement in your neck of the woods, had criticized tactics. I mean, it is a much different setting from urban policing. And there's been a lot of questions about the sort of rules of engagement, when to use force. I've covered some of the use of these quote unquote less lethal weapons like pepper spray and rubber bullets and so forth. And, this escalation has coincided with, Homeland Security's decision to sort of shorten training and move these agents into much different environments. And that's something I know that law enforcement experts are watching, and certainly we're here to document and chronicle.
So is it fair to say it looks, the intention is different here? It looks different here than it would, say, on the border, where you've seen kind of with your own eyes what's been happening down there? Because I think, again, living here, we don't have a whole lot of context unless you've lived, on a border and seen it with your own eyes. But, as you've been kind of watching all of this, I'm just really curious now that you've kind of seen both worlds, how you can help people here understand how this is kind of different from what's going on in other parts of the country and some of these border areas.
Sure. I mean, dispersing, Border Patrol and immigration enforcement agents into an American city well away from a point of entry is new territory for us all. And, we've sort of seen that escalating from LA to Chicago and now your neck of the woods, where previously a lot of these officers, they worked ports of entry, checking, to make sure undocumented folks aren't coming in. There are specialized teams, that engage in some higher risk activity. But I don't think we have an analog for the sort of things we've seen in the past, 6 months to a year.
Yeah. And then just finally, again, back to kind of the record piece of this, it's always really important. And as journalists, when you have information, there's always that if you don't have it confirmed by, authorities, there's always that pause that you take of saying, okay, you guys, if we're going to do this, we need to be sure. So I guess just asking you, how were you able to obtain this government documents? Maybe not the how, but what government, how did you get to the place where you guys felt confident that, yes, we can release the identities?
Well, as you know, I mean, in the course of investigative reporting, you do have sources and you deal with sensitive information that you have to protect, and you have to weigh that against, publication. I have reviewed government documents that show, these are the agents whom the government has identified as having fired their weapons in this altercation, which we've all been, tuned into for well over a week now. And that's what we can say for now. The Homeland Security, CBP have taken the tack of, shielding these agents, and as you used the word doxing earlier, being critical of really any media coverage of these operations, and that's their right. I certainly would appreciate a confirmation, and I suspect that we're going to see more and more of that.
All right, David, thanks for joining us today. We appreciate your time in sharing what you guys found in your investigation.
Thank you.
All right.